Highbridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Gold, Oil, and Avocados, A Recent History of Latin America in 16 Commodities, by Andy Robinson, read by Andre Bellido. In the colonial and neo-colonial alchemy, gold changes into scrap metal, and food into poison. Eduardo Galeano, Open Veins of Latin America. Introduction. Itaituba, The Battle for the Future. How would Eduardo Galeano write his classic Open Veins of Latin America today? It seemed the right question to ask during a visit to the boomtown of Itaituba on the banks of the Tapajós River in the Brazilian Amazon. The Workers' Party was still in power, and I had traveled from Rio de Janeiro to assess whether the controversial growth acceleration program, championed by President Dilma Rousseff, would prove compatible with the survival of the planetary lung, and, more immediately, of the 13,000 citizens of the Munduruku indigenous community who lived along the banks of the Tapajós. Under the scheme, the Munduruku's millenary lands would be flooded by the gigantic hydroelectric project of São Luís do Tapajós, planned to generate electricity for the new Amazonian metropolises as well as the megamines and soybean plants. After a 13-hour passage upriver aboard a Fitzcarraldian ferry boat from Santarém, the jungle capital, itself a 7-hour flight from Rio, the last thing I expected to encounter were 5 jet skis equipped with 2600cc engines. But there they were, zigzagging before a wake of white foam. After millennia of silence, broken only by the shrieks, howls, and buzzing of the deep jungle, perhaps Itaituba felt the need for deafening noise and breakneck speed. Jet skis are all the rage here. You will see 15 or 20 a weekend. Mine reaches 105 miles per hour, said Bruno, 18 years old, as he coupled his Yamaha to a 4x4. While we spoke, a riverboat plying the Tapajós from Santarém, 200 miles downstream, docked and unloaded 5 quad motor tractors, ideal for racing along the newly opened jungle trails. Bruno explained he had bought his jet ski for 20,000 reais, more than 7,000, with his wages as a construction worker paving the Trans-Amazonian Highway that would bring forth a new phase of uncontrolled deforestation. But there were other ways to make a quick buck in Itaituba. Teeming with banks and gold merchants and a population that was growing explosively, the frontier city was the center of all extractive activities in the western Amazon state of Pará, most of them illegal, from panning for precious metals and stones to clearing the rainforests for timber. Not to mention the soybeans loaded at the terminal built by the multinational agribusiness corporation Bunge. Another boost to the economy was expected with the construction of the megadam 30 miles upstream in Munduruku territory and the new waterways for the transport of soy, minerals, and timber. Has Itaituba changed much in recent years? I asked Bruno, the son of impoverished migrants from the outskirts of Brasilia, who had chanced the move to the Amazon 30 years earlier, in search of wealth or at least 2 plates of beans and yuca a day. He looked to one side and pointed to 7 black vultures, urubu in Portuguese, perched on a pile of garbage, wings spread like funeral curtains. You think there are a lot of urubus over there, right? Well, in the old days, there were many more. The scene in Itaituba seemed to illustrate the contradictions of the Latin American left's economic development project. Taking power at the beginning of the new century, the so-called pink-tide progressive governments rightly perceived a crucial need to accelerate growth in order to eliminate poverty and extreme inequality, burdens that the region had shouldered from the first era of mass enslavement, in the gold and silver mines in the 16th century, and the second, that arrived in chains from Africa, to toil in the plantations of the first commodity crops, sugar, bananas, coffee, for the new global market. Brazil's former president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, or as he is affectionately known, Lula, was justifiably proud of lifting 42 million previously excluded Brazilians into what he called the new middle class. Achieving and maintaining the support of Latin American workers like Bruno required constant improvements in the population's material well-being, and the fastest way to achieve this without triggering an external debt crisis was through exports of raw materials, minerals, monoculture cash crops like soy and meat, and the foreign exchange that these would generate. In a time of diminishing resources and the rise of China as a superpower, raw materials were valued as never before, and the temptation to rev up the extraction machine was difficult to resist. A race for ever more scarce resources in a quasi-Cold War between China and the United States made the model even more seductive. But how could the strategy prosper without committing the same atrocities as in the classic epochs of the plunder of Latin America, captured so vividly in Galeano's great book? Environmental destruction and accelerating deforestation in the Amazon, after all, was not only hastening planetary climate change and bringing catastrophic droughts to the Andes and Central America, it had also raised the risk of killer pandemics, as the slaughterhouses and feeding lots of the new Latin American meatpacking industry became the biggest in the world, and the pathogens of wildest nature were released into the slums of jungle metropolises. Burgeoning Amazon towns like Itaituba, with poor sanitation and chaotic urbanization, had already become breeding grounds for Zika, the mosquito-borne virus that threatened to spread throughout Brazil, terrifying athletes due to perform at the 2016 Rio Olympics. Then there were the political problems generated by the model. If Bruno was typical of this new aspirational middle class, with aspirations to consume more, perhaps even more jet skis, how could it uphold the principles of equality and environmental protection that progressive governments from Brazil to Ecuador had championed? The problem would soon be confirmed by the defeat of the Workers' Party in Brazil, and its replacement by a ruthless extreme right-wing government under Jair Bolsonaro that was closely allied to mining and agribusiness. The new middle class had destroyed its creator, a fate shared a year later by Evo Morales in Bolivia, though Morales' movement toward socialism staged an impressive comeback. As the rivalry for access to natural resources between China and the United States intensified, Latin American progressive governments also became vulnerable to Washington-led regime change policies, threatening a return to the years when Galeano wrote his masterpiece, and most of the continent was governed by brutal pro-U.S. military regimes. In this book, a collection of chronicles based on a range of raw materials extracted in Latin America, from soy to niobium, beef to gold, and oil to avocado, I try to reflect on this dilemma as well as analyze the dramatic events. Coups d'état soft or hard in Honduras, Bolivia, and Brazil. Extraordinary popular uprisings in Santiago de Chile, Quito, and Bogotá, and the likelihood of more social unrest after the devastation caused by COVID-19 that have shaken the region in recent years. Some of Galeano's destinations are revisited, icons of colonial plunder and pillage such as Potosí, Minas Gerais, and Zacatecas, where I have tried to update his bold thesis. Based on the dependency theories of Immanuel Wallerstein, Celso Furtado, and André Gunder Frank, that in a world of powerful centers and subjugated outposts, we Latin Americans are poor because the ground we tread is rich. Open Veins of Latin America, written when Galeano was only 28 years old, was the Bible of a generation of the left that came to power in Latin America at the beginning of the new century. From Lula to Evo Morales, Rafael Correa to Hugo Chavez. Chavez even gave a copy of the book to a skeptical Barack Obama. But of the two main messages in Galeano's argument, the need to break the ties of dependence with the ex-colonial powers and their multinational corporations, while steering the economy away from dependency on the export of raw materials, only the first has been heeded. The dependence of the export of commodities remained in many countries, and when inevitably the supercycle of high international prices of minerals, oil, and basic foodstuffs ended in a second wave of the great financial crisis, the failure would prove costly for a leftist project that appeared to have found the magic formula to redistribute income, and, at the same time, stay in government. The pink tide receded, and the left fell from power, in Ecuador, Brazil, Chile, Argentina, and briefly in Bolivia. While in Venezuela, a catastrophic socio-economic crisis weakened Chavism to a point unimaginable 10 years earlier, and an unresolved problem of dependence on oil exports heightened Venezuela's vulnerability to U.S.-sponsored coups. Reassessed, the spectacular social conquests of the left's decade in power seemed chimeras, the unsustainable windfall of a bubble in the commodities market. Ironically, Galeano contributed to the crisis of ideas on the left by renouncing his very own book in 2014, at the Literary Biennial in Brasilia, calling it simplistic, the work of a young man with no grasp of economics, infected by the dogmatism of the old left. I wouldn't be capable of reading this book again. I'd keel over, he joked, a year before his death. Galeano's mea culpa gave way to a round of backslapping by the usual suspects of the Latin American right. Álvaro Vargas Llosa, whose book, Guide to the Perfect Latin American Idiot, was a crude caricature of open veins, celebrated the intellectual defeat of the left. Michael Reed, the Americas editor for The Economist, declared the definitive retreat of the pink tide and dubbed Galeano's book the work of a propagandist. A potent mix of selective truths, exaggeration and falsehood, caricature and conspiracy theory, a description better suited, in my view, to Reed's magazine than to Galeano's masterwork. During my travels in Latin America as an itinerant reporter for the Barcelona-based newspaper La Vanguardia, I came to a different conclusion than Reed. The young Eduardo Galeano, far from exaggerating the destruction caused in Latin America by the forces of global capitalism allied with local elites, had underestimated the damage. Looting has occurred not only in the economic sphere of the extraction of raw materials, but also in the extraction of the soul from peoples whose cultures, and that Quechua philosophy of sumac causai, or good living, are being annihilated in a remorseless process of commodification. Maybe the latest open veins are more subtle, and certainly more environmental. The conversion of Peruvian ceviche into a symbol of international gastronomic status, cited by International Monetary Fund, IMF, Managing Director Christine Lagarde, as an inspiration for their programs in Latin America, while an island of plastic floats in the Pacific. The new tourism of exotic experience embodied in the trains of the Andes, privatized by the Peruvian state and sold to Belmond, a subsidiary of the global luxury branding company LVMH, whose transparent carriages allowed travelers to Machu Picchu to contemplate poverty from a safe distance, on a parched altiplano now bereft of glaciers. The difference now is that many governments of the left, without belittling the colossal social gains that they have achieved, have been complicit in the same material and spiritual pillage as those that preceded them. What has been done here is bullshit. Now we have soy, and more soy, remarked Edilberto Sena when we met in Santarém. The charmingly foul-mouthed Franciscan monk was one of the followers of liberation theology who helped found the Workers' Party in Amazonia 3 decades before. It was not only a lament for the thousands of campesinos forced by the latest cash crop to move to the city, but for the disappearance of a rich and complex culture based on the staggering biodiversity of the Amazon. In a broad swathe of countries from Brazil to Ecuador, Venezuela to Chile, I witnessed fierce debates between those appalled by the pink tide government's embrace of neo-extractivism and those who dismissed the anti-extractivists as romantic dreamers, unaware of the urgent need to raise growth rates as a means to combat poverty and generate development. Oil and mining helped us avoid the Chinese path of inhuman wages and precarious labor conditions, said Fausto Herrera, finance minister of Ecuador, under Rafael Correa, whose frustrated attempt to leave millions of tons of oil in the Amazon subsoil was a model for the environmental movement, until Correa backtracked. Correa's critics, led by Alberto Acosta, another former minister, opposed extractivism and defended new means to measure welfare inspired by sumac causai. The same splits occurred in Bolivia, where some members of the environmental movement went so far as to support the coup against Evo Morales because of his turn to mining and agribusiness. These chronicles support a position that will please no one. That common ground has to be found between the two schools of thought. These are issues of universal concern, but things are more clearly focused in Latin America, a region in which computers coexist with the most archaic forms of peasant culture, and with all modes of production in history. To quote the U.S. philosopher Frederick Jameson's article on 100 Years of Solitude in the London Review of Books, the surviving remnants of these past worlds, their inhabitants still protected in mind and body from the forces that destroy the rest of us, turn the region into a key actor in the struggle to defend the planet. This lesson is being learned fast in Colombia, where ex-guerrilla Gustavo Petro's innovative humanist project rejected all aggressive extractivisms and placed climate change at the heart of his bid for the presidency in the elections he came close to winning in 2018. The same ideas drove some of the mass mobilizations against the conservative government of Iván Duque that filled the streets of Bogotá, Medellín, and Barranquilla in the autumn of 2019, and the protests in Chile and Ecuador, where signs emerged of a new movement committed to a different way forward. Latin American experts at international think tanks and in the global media, from Reed to Alma Guillermo Prieto, and Monica de Boye, a Brazilian economist based in Washington, were deeply pessimistic about the 2019 protests. Far from hope, the discontent in Latin America in past weeks has been driven by what we might call a post-commodity bubble syndrome, wrote de Boye in an article for the Peterson Institute. But Washington has never been a place to feel optimistic about Latin America. The Andean Altiplano told a different story. When I ambled through the Baroque center of Ecuador's capital, Quito, in October 2019, surrounded by Quechua street vendors visibly encouraged by the success of their rebellion against the Lenin Moreno government, another more positive reading of events emerged. This time, the agenda of social transformation, forged in huge popular mobilizations, would have a more solid foundation than the price of oil, copper, or soy on the Chicago commodity market. Although the immediate cause of the protests in Ecuador was a rise in the price of gasoline after the IMF-designed withdrawal of energy subsidies, the presence of so many pollera-clad indigenous women bravely defying the rubber bullets of the anti-riot police suggested that the defense of the Pachamama, Mother Earth, would be a central element of the next stage of struggle. Proof came in the inclusion of the principles of sumac causai in the alternative plan to the IMF's shock therapy, which was drawn up by the Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities of Ecuador, CONAIE, and presented to the government at a tense ceremony at the Catholic Episcopal Conference in Quito, which I attended. The left's young candidate in the 2021 elections, Andrés Araúz, seemed more open to reconciliation with the indigenous project than his mentor, Correa, although divisions remained and Araúz finally lost to the millionaire banker, Guillermo Lasso. In Chile, too, the multicolored flags of the Mapuche became a ubiquitous emblem of mass protest against the most successful model of neoliberalism in Latin America, eulogized by think tanks, market analysts, and oligarchs alike, but despised by everyone else. Perhaps the rebellions would be a new link in the alliance between the Latin American left and the emerging global movement against climate change. While the COVID-19 pandemic exposed Latin America's continuing social inequality and failing health systems, it also demonstrated once again the capacity of favelas, slums in Brazilian megacities, or ranchos in Venezuela to organize collective self-protection. After rereading Open Veins of Latin America during long trips by plane, bus, and on occasion riverboat, far from bored by the leaden prose of the pedantic left, I felt inspired once again, as I had been in my youth, by the young Galeano's desire to write about political economy in the style of a novel about love or pirates. In these vignettes, I have tried to follow that example. Each chapter reflects on the end use of raw materials in a world of ostentatious consumption, extreme inequality, and dwindling natural resources. The diamonds extracted by the Brazilian garimpeiros in an inferno of mud and violence, processed in Surat, India, and bought in Swarovski stores in Dubai. The prototypes of hypersonic missiles assembled in California or Shenzhen, with the niobium extracted close to indigenous territories in Amazonia, now the target of mining companies allied with the new Brazilian ultra-right, led by Bolsonaro. The soy from a deforested Amazon that supplies industrial chicken plants in Europe, which then churn out 1 billion chicken McNuggets. Or the vast herds of melancholic zebu in Amazonian latifundia, grazing in the wake of chainsaws and forest fires to supply Burger King. The conversion of the potato, the sustenance to the great pre-Columbian civilizations in the Andean highlands, into the addictive potato chip of Frito-Lay, PepsiCo, and its contribution to an epidemic of obesity in Latin America. A global fashion of guacamole that has turned the Mexican region of Michoacán, cradle of the Purépecha Empire, a more complex society than the Aztecs, into a monoculture of avocado run by organized crime. A visit to San Luis Potosí in Mexico uncovers how the indigenous Huichol's success in avoiding the reopening of a 19th-century silver mine has been clouded by an invasion of tourists, many keen to try the hallucinogenic properties of the peyote cactus. Chapters on oil and iron ore discuss how overdependence on raw materials has sown the seeds of disaster for progressive governments in Venezuela and Brazil, causing an economic crisis that persuaded broad swathes of society to support U.S.-driven coups d'etat. The Mexican president Andrés Manuel López Obrador's bid to repeat the petronationalism of Lázaro Cárdenas is also discussed. In Bolivia, a visit to the Salar de Uyuni, the largest lithium deposit in the world, shows how Evo Morales' socialist indigenous government's attempt To industrialize extraction with new battery plants ended in a rebellion of the middle class, and, in November 2019, a coup d'etat. In the rarefied atmosphere of the Bolivian Altiplano, another existential question is posed. Which is worse, a lithium mine or 10,000 tourists posing for selfies against the sunset? In the chapter on gold, a trip from Colombia and Central America, that ends in Utah links record gold prices and the rush to open mines after the 2008 global financial crisis to conservative thinking in the United States, and then back to impoverished gold prospectors in Colombia. In its own perverse way, the 21st century El Dorado is another example of a new era of open veins. A search for the safe haven of gold in the metropolis unleashes yet another destructive invasion by thousands of garimpeiros and barqueros, artisanal miners, in the Amazon and the Andes. A terrible irony emerges, too, from the plan for a global transition to a zero-emissions economy to avoid catastrophic climate change. As Jason Hickel notes in his new book Less is More, trying to meet this challenge without questioning capitalism's growth imperative will require massive increases in the extraction of materials such as copper, cobalt, silver, lithium, and the elusive rare earths. Mining has already become a big driver of deforestation, ecosystem collapse, and biodiversity loss around the world. If we're not careful, growing demand for renewable energy will exacerbate this crisis significantly, he writes. Parts of Latin America, Africa, and Asia are likely to become the target of a new scramble for resources and new forms of colonization. Grotesquely, Latin America may see its veins opened further by a corporate-friendly plan for a market-driven green economy. A new development model in Latin America will require a radical change of philosophy, beyond the simple extraction of raw materials, and beyond the old formulas of industrialization, oxidized in the lost world of Fordlandia. The industrial city of rubber that Henry Ford tried to found 3 hours by boat from Itaituba, now overgrown by vines and ipe trees, where macaque monkeys scamper across the rusting processing machines. Without abandoning the advances and social goals of the decade of the left in South America, it is now the time to devise new systems of production on a smaller scale and linked to an eco-economy, a radical redistribution of income, and less destructive consumption. Instead of centralizing power in one person and co-opting the social movements that cleared the route to power, it is crucial to broaden and deepen democracy. If the left is given another opportunity in Latin America, a seed perhaps already sown in the spectacular citizens' movements in Santiago, Bogotá, Quito, and even Lima, it is essential that alternatives are considered. Inspiration may come in part from the indigenous philosophy of the Sumak Kawsay regarding models of society compatible with the protection of the environment and culture. This is not a romantic longing for a society of hunters and collectors in a Rousseauian state of bon sauvage. As is explained in the final chapter, which describes the Munduruku's epic struggle against the São Luís de Tapajós hydro dam, the Amazon's past is a relevant lesson in development. 2 millennia ago, long before the arrival of the Europeans, Amazonia housed a society of 8 million inhabitants that built roads and managed the forest in a sophisticated and sustainable way. Its inhabitants even practiced genetic modification to ensure food security through crops, such as cassava. Fish were farmed and urban parks stretched along the banks of the Amazon's mighty rivers. "We are the guardians of the jungle," Jairo Sá, one of the leaders of the Munduruku in Itaituba, told me in a statement of fact, not pretense, during my visit to the Tapajós. The Munduruku understand technology. They have delimited their lands using GPS to demonstrate with scientific accuracy their territorial rights to defend the jungle. When we spoke next in Rio de Janeiro, Jairo Sá was on his way to Los Angeles to meet a group of General Electric engineers and try to persuade them to abandon the hydro dam project. If they do not listen, there is no future for them or for anybody else, he said as he headed off in a yellow Rio taxi to Galeão International Airport. Part 1. Extraction. Chapter 1. Iron. Minas Gerais, Brazil, the brutal force. Bento Rodrigues is a town that no longer exists. 6 months after the collapse of the main containment dam at the Samarco iron mine and the sudden death of the river Doce, the Sweet River, some might think it never did. Make a right down the dirt track, they told us at the last gas station in Mariana, where the young Mineira girls, perhaps sensitized to the devastating power of fate, lined up to have their palms read by the local fortune-tellers. But beware, it is forbidden to go. The road was as red as rusted iron, and 3 urubu vultures flew on ahead through the dense jungle of the Mata Atlantica, like angelic guides in a journey to hell. Little was left of the town. The sole remnant was a wooden sign erected by the state tourist authority, somehow untouched by the deadly wave. It marked the ancient Camino Real, where the Portuguese transported gold and diamonds from the mines that gave their name to the Brazilian state of Minas Gerais, General Mines. In Bento Rodrigues, try our authentic Mineira dishes, read a sign describing the delicious pork and yuca, feijão tropeiro, and chicken with quiabo, okra, that would surely attract tourists from the moneyed capital, Belo Horizonte, in a bid by the historic Paraopeba mining towns to shake off their dependence on iron ore. But not anymore. On the other bank, only 3 or 4 houses poked out above the mountains of mud, lit under the mining company's spotlights like a Belém nativity scene as dusk thickened. Bento, a small town of some 600 inhabitants, was the epicenter of the largest environmental disaster in the history of Brazil, though no one would have thought it given the lack of interest from international media, which focused instead on the Zika viral epidemic, gang warfare in Rio's favelas as the Olympics approached, or Neymar's latest haircut. Having erased Bento from the map, a tsunami of 50 million tons of mining waste material, equivalent to 24,000 Olympic swimming pools filled with toxic mud, crashed downriver as far as the port city of Espírito Santo, 500 miles away where the Rio Doce meets the Atlantic, destroying everything in its path. Amazingly, only 19 people were killed, 2 in Bento Rodrigues. But the damage to the river, the second biggest in Brazil after the Amazon, was catastrophic. The cause of the collapse, according to an initial investigation by the Brazilian Federal Police, was a rise in water content in the sludge of waste material piled up against the dam. This was compounded, said the police report, by the negligence of the technicians at the Samarco mine, owned jointly by 2 giants of the global mining industry, the Brazilian corporation Companhia Vale do Rio Doce and the Anglo-Australian BHP Billiton. A small seismic movement was the trigger for the catastrophe. When I visited the area during Easter week of 2016, 5 months after the disaster, more than 1 million people lacked drinking water, and fishing was banned along the full length of the river, depriving 1.4 million people of their principal means of subsistence. Some of the worst affected were the Krenak, an indigenous community that stretched for hundreds of miles along the river, whose main source of nutrition were the 80-plus species of fish that had populated the river before the disaster, 11 of them unique to the Rio Doce's ecosystem. All 11 were now in danger of extinction. The river is irrevocably altered. The sediments have moved. It is now another river with a completely different morphology, said Marcelo Campos, director of the Brazilian Institute of the Environment and Renewable Natural Resources, IBAMA, in Belo Horizonte, who appeared shocked by his own diagnosis of the disaster. Vale do Rio Doce and BHP Billiton insisted that there were no toxic elements in the waste material that had washed downriver, but it was well known that the chemical agent etheramino was used in the separation process to obtain the iron ore at Samarco and the other Mariana mines. In a technical report on the toxicity of etheramino Montal 800, the Swiss company Clariant, which had doubled production of the agent during the Brazilian mining boom, warned of the dangers to aquatic life of a non-biodegradable toxin. The Doce River was effectively dead, and that Easter week in Minas Gerais, no one dared to venture how long the wait for resurrection would be. A generation will be born and raised on the banks of a forbidden river, said Ailton Krenak, a Krenak philosopher and author of the essay, Ideas to Postpone the End of the World. It is a terrifying vision of the future of the planet. Brazil's vast reserves of iron ore are the key to understanding a decade of U.S. intervention at the beginning of the Cold War, culminating in the 1964 coup d'etat designed with the interests of U.S. Steel and Hanna Mining Corporation in mind. In fact, as Galeano dryly notes in Open Veins of Latin America, the Minas Gerais mines were of such importance to Washington's strategy in the region that the U.S. Embassy in the then capital of Brazil, Rio de Janeiro, created a new diplomatic post, the Mineral Attaché, who had at least as much work as the military or cultural attachés, so much indeed that 2 mineral attachés were soon appointed instead of 1.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?